Marissa Smith. The first case on our list is Marissa Smith. On a September day in 2022, 17-year-old Marissa Smith from Louisville, Ohio, stabbed 22-year-old Michael Morris during an altercation at Wildwood Park. Michael Morris was from Alliance, Ohio. The encounter at the park would end his life and change Marissa's forever. According to court records, the confrontation began as a dispute between groups at the park. What started as words escalated quickly. A 15-year-old who was with Marissa provided her with a knife. The exact sequence of events that followed became the subject of intense examination during the trial. What investigators knew for certain was that Marissa used the knife to inflict a fatal wound to Michael's chest. The injury was severe. Michael was rushed to the hospital but could not be saved. Police arrested Marissa shortly after the incident. The 15-year-old accomplice was also taken into custody. The younger individual faced charges in juvenile court for aiding in the incident. The weapon was recovered. Witnesses came forward with accounts of what they had seen. The investigation moved quickly, with prosecutors building their case against Marissa as the primary actor in Michael's passing. During the legal proceedings, Marissa's defense team attempted to argue self-protection. They claimed she had acted in response to a threat. Prosecutors rejected this narrative entirely, emphasizing Marissa's aggressive actions. They presented evidence showing that Marissa had choices in those critical moments. She could have retreated. She could have called for help. Instead, she chose to use the knife. What drives a confrontation from words to fatal action? The trial took place in May 2023. It lasted 4 days. The jury heard testimony from witnesses who had been at the park that day. They reviewed forensic evidence, including the weapon used. Medical examiners explained the nature of Michael's injury and why it proved fatal. The defense presented their arguments about the circumstances, but the prosecution's case proved stronger. After deliberation, the jury returned with guilty verdicts on charges of taking a life and felonious harm. Judge Natalie Haupt presided over the sentencing hearing. She sentenced Marissa to life in prison with eligibility for parole after 15 years. During sentencing, the judge made pointed remarks about Marissa's choices. She noted that Marissa had left Michael to pass away without seeking help for him. This decision to walk away rather than call for assistance weighed heavily in the judge's consideration. Michael Morris's family attended the proceedings. They provided impact statements describing their loss. One family member expressed that every single one of them had experienced a kind of ending that day. The grief in the courtroom was palpable. For them, no sentence could restore what had been taken. Marissa Smith remains incarcerated as of 2026. She will be eligible to seek parole in 2037. The case drew attention to youth-related incidents in public spaces, but another case would involve far more calculated actions. Daphne Abdallah. In 1997, Central Park in New York City became the scene of a shocking incident. 15-year-old Daphne Abdallah and her boyfriend, Christopher Vasquez, encountered 44-year-old Michael McMorrow. The three were in the park during the evening hours. What began as an encounter would end with Michael's body found in a lake, bearing more than 30 wounds from a knife. Daphne and Christopher had been rollerblading and drinking in the park. They met Michael McMorrow during their time there. According to later accounts, Daphne claimed Michael had given them substances, including something she described as LSD. She said this led to hallucinations. However, the exact trigger for what happened next remained unclear. The attack on Michael was extensive. He was stabbed repeatedly. His body showed signs of intentional harm beyond what would be necessary to cause his passing. In a particularly disturbing detail, the body had been mutilated in an apparent attempt to make it sink in the water. Daphne later suggested this action during the incident. After the attack, Daphne and Christopher were found bathing together. Their clothes were bloodied. Rather than flee entirely, Daphne made a call to authorities. When she spoke to emergency services, she attempted to place blame solely on Christopher. She portrayed herself as a witness rather than a participant. However, physical evidence told a different story. Both teenagers had Michael's blood on their clothing. Both had been present during the attack. The forensic evidence made it impossible to accept Daphne's initial version of events. Police arrested both teenagers and began building their cases. The motive remained murky throughout the investigation and trial. Prosecutors suggested possibilities ranging from thrill-seeking to rage. There was no robbery. There was no prior relationship between the teenagers and Michael. What could motivate such an attack on a stranger? The randomness of the target made the case even more disturbing. Some speculated the substances may have played a role, though this did not excuse the actions. The level of harm used suggested something beyond impaired judgment. Rather than proceed to a full trial where she would have to testify, Daphne accepted a plea agreement in 1998. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter rather than face more serious charges. This allowed her to avoid testifying about the details of what happened that night. Christopher Vasquez went to trial and was also convicted of manslaughter. The plea deal resulted in Daphne receiving a sentence that recognized her youth while still imposing consequences. During later proceedings, Daphne expressed remorse. She stated she could never adequately express her sorrow for what happened. The words seemed genuine, though they could not undo the harm. She served 6 years before being released in 2004. Following her release, Daphne attempted to rebuild her life in New York. She maintained a low profile. In 2009, she was involved in an accident that left her using a cane. By 2026, she continues to live quietly. The next case would involve questions that persist to this day. Nora Jackson. In June 2005, 18-year-old Nora Jackson discovered her mother Jennifer in their Memphis, Tennessee home. Jennifer had been stabbed multiple times. The scene was chaotic. The home appeared to have been ransacked. Items were disturbed throughout the residence. For Nora, finding her mother this way was traumatic. For investigators, she would become the primary suspect despite significant questions about the evidence. The investigation faced complications from the start. Jennifer's father had been taken from them the year before in an unsolved case. This raised questions about whether there might be a pattern or connection. The ransacking suggested someone had broken in searching for something. Multiple rooms showed signs of disturbance. Yet police focused on Nora. They noted tensions between mother and daughter over typical teenage issues. They pointed to the potential for inheritance as a motive. They built a case around circumstantial factors rather than direct physical evidence. Forensic analysis told a different story than the prosecution's narrative. DNA testing found genetic material from multiple individuals at the scene. None of this DNA matched Nora. The evidence suggested the presence of intruders. Fingerprints that did not belong to the family were found. The physical evidence pointed away from Nora rather than toward her. Despite this, prosecutors moved forward with charges. They relied heavily on the testimony of Nora's friend, Andrew Hammock. He claimed Nora had made certain statements to him. His testimony became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The trial in 2009 proceeded without Nora's defense calling any witnesses. This unusual strategy proved ineffective. The jury convicted her of second-degree ending of life. She was sentenced to significant prison time. Could someone be convicted without physical evidence linking them to the incident? What the jury never heard would eventually overturn this conviction. Prosecutors had withheld crucial information. Andrew Hammock, the key witness, had written a letter admitting he had been under the influence when he gave his testimony. He acknowledged that his statements might not be reliable. This letter was never provided to the defense team as required by law. The state had violated Nora's rights by withholding exculpatory evidence. In 2014, the conviction was overturned based on prosecutorial misconduct. After serving 11 years, Nora was offered a choice. She could face another trial, or she could enter what is known as an Alford plea. This type of plea allows someone to maintain their innocence while acknowledging the state has evidence it believes supports a conviction. Nora chose the Alford plea to voluntary manslaughter, a lesser charge than second-degree murder, to gain her immediate freedom. She was released in August 2016 and has since become a dedicated advocate for the wrongly convicted. Nora has consistently maintained her innocence. The Innocence Project has taken up her case. Ongoing DNA testing may eventually provide definitive answers about who was in that house. The unidentified DNA remains a central question. Multiple individuals' genetic material was present, yet Nora's was not. For Jennifer Jackson's family, the case remains unresolved in many ways. For Nora, 11 years were taken that cannot be returned. Another case would involve premeditation that shocked investigators. Scarlett Jenkinson. In February 2023, in Warrington, England, 15-year-old Scarlett Jenkinson and her friend Eddie Ratcliffe carried out a planned attack in a park. Their target was 16-year-old Brianna Gay, a transgender girl who attended school in the area. The attack was not spontaneous. It had been discussed and planned in advance. Messages between Scarlett and Eddie revealed they had chosen Brianna specifically and had prepared for what they intended to do. The assault took place in Culcheth Linear Park. Scarlett and Eddie lured Brianna to the park under the pretense of spending time together. Once there, they attacked her with a knife. Brianna was stabbed 28 times. The attack was sustained and brutal. She had no chance to escape or defend herself. Passers-by discovered her body in the park. The discovery shocked the community and launched an immediate investigation. Police quickly identified Scarlett and Eddie as suspects. Digital evidence proved crucial to the case. Investigators recovered messages between the two teenagers that showed planning. They had discussed targeting Brianna. They had talked about methods. The messages revealed a disturbing level of premeditation. This was not an argument that escalated. This was a calculated plan put into action. The content of these messages would become central to the prosecution's case. What could drive teenagers to plan such an act? The investigation revealed complex motivations. Evidence suggested that Brianna's identity as a transgender individual played a role. There were indications of bias and hatred in the messages. The case drew significant attention to issues of identity-based targeting. Beyond this, there appeared to be elements of what experts described as interest in causing harm for its own sake. The planning, the selection of a vulnerable target, and the nature of the attack all pointed to deeply concerning thought patterns. Both Scarlett and Eddie were arrested and charged. The trial examined the evidence in detail. The prosecution presented the digital messages showing planning. They brought in forensic experts who testified about the attack itself. The defense attempted to shift responsibility between the two defendants. Each side tried to argue the other had been the primary instigator. However, the evidence showed both had participated willingly. Both had planned. Both had been present. Both had acted. The jury found both guilty. Scarlett Jenkinson received a life sentence with a minimum term of 22 years before eligibility for parole. Eddie Ratcliffe received a similar sentence with a minimum of 20 years. The judge noted the planned nature of the attack and the vulnerability of the victim. The sentences reflected both the severity of the actions and the fact that the defendants were themselves teenagers at the time. Brianna Gay's family attended the proceedings. They spoke about the person they had lost. Brianna had been living authentically as herself. She had faced challenges, but was working toward her future. The case sparked broader conversations about protecting vulnerable youth and addressing bias. For Scarlett and Eddie, they will spend their formative adult years incarcerated. The park where Brianna lost her life became a memorial site. But the next case would involve financial motives. Catherine Bellflower. In June 2002, in Alameda County, California, 17-year-old Catherine Bellflower became involved in a plan that would end the life of 17-year-old Jenna Nanetti. Jenna was shot with a shotgun in what appeared at first to be a random attack. However, investigators would discover that her passing was anything but random. It was part of a calculated scheme driven by financial gain through an insurance policy. Catherine's boyfriend at the time was central to the planning. The motive was straightforward, yet shocking. Jenna had an insurance policy. If she passed away, there would be a payout. Catherine and her boyfriend conspired to cause Jenna's passing and collect the money. They developed a plan to make the incident appear as something other than what it was. The shotgun attack was meant to obscure the true motive. As police investigated Jenna's background, they discovered the insurance policy. They began looking at who would benefit from her passing. This led them to Catherine and her boyfriend. The connection between the victim and the suspects became clear. They had known each other. The insurance policy linked them financially. When investigators dug into communications and movements on the day of the incident, evidence of planning emerged. The seemingly random shooting was revealed to be a premeditated act with a clear profit motive. Could someone really plan the ending of a peer for money? The evidence against Catherine included her participation in planning discussions. Phone records, witness statements, and forensic evidence all pointed to her involvement. While her boyfriend may have been the one who physically carried out the attack, Catherine had been part of the conspiracy. She had knowledge of what was planned. She had participated in discussions. Under California law, this made her equally culpable. Prosecutors charged her with taking a life in connection with the insurance scheme. Rather than face a trial where all the evidence would be presented publicly, Catherine accepted a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to charges related to Jenna's passing. This plea meant acknowledging her role in the conspiracy and the act itself. It meant accepting responsibility for what had happened. The plea agreement provided some certainty about sentencing, rather than risking what a jury might decide after hearing the full scope of the planning and execution. In July 2005, Judge Jeffrey Horner sentenced Catherine to 25 years to life in prison. The sentence reflected the planned nature of the incident and the motive of financial gain. The judge noted the betrayal involved in the case. Jenna had known Catherine. She had not suspected that her supposed friend was part of a conspiracy against her. Jenna Nanetti's family attended the sentencing. They provided statements about their loss. Jenna had been just 17, the same age as Catherine. She had her whole life ahead of her. The fact that her passing was motivated by financial greed rather than any conflict made the loss harder to process. Catherine Bellflower was granted parole in 2022 under California's Senate Bill 394, which allows for the reconsideration of life sentences for juvenile offenders. As of 2026, she has been released from prison and is living under parole supervision. The next case would involve disputed circumstances and claims of innocence. Shonda Crane. In 1995, in Louisiana, Shonda Crane was convicted for the passing of her parents. The case involved claims of coercion and questions about her actual involvement. Shonda maintained her innocence throughout the proceedings. The prosecution alleged that the motive was linked to insurance money. They claimed Shonda participated in planning what would happen to her parents. The evidence presented included testimony from others involved in the incident. Shonda's defense argued that she had been coerced into involvement. They claimed she was not the instigator and that she had acted under duress from others. The defense presented evidence suggesting her participation was minimal and forced. They argued that her youth at the time made her particularly vulnerable to manipulation by older individuals who had more control over the situation. The defense team worked to paint a picture of someone caught up in events beyond her control. The prosecution countered that, regardless of who initiated the plan, Shonda had participated and had knowledge of what was happening. They argued that she had opportunities to stop the events or report what was planned. They presented evidence that suggested she had been more involved than she claimed. The jury heard testimony from multiple witnesses about the events leading up to and following her parents' passing. They examined physical evidence and communications that had been recovered. The trial resulted in a conviction. Shanda was sentenced to life in prison. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the charges involving the ending of her parents' lives. However, questions about the fairness of her conviction have persisted over the years. Advocates for her case have pointed to potential issues with how the trial was conducted. They have raised concerns about whether all evidence was properly presented and whether her youth was adequately considered during sentencing. Could a young person be wrongfully convicted under coercive circumstances? In recent years, Shanda has sought clemency. Her clemency petition argues that she was wrongfully convicted. It presents arguments about coercion and insufficient evidence of her direct participation. The petition has drawn support from those who believe her case represents a potential miscarriage of justice. Supporters point to her consistent claims of innocence and the questions surrounding the evidence used to convict her. Opposition remains from those who believe the original conviction was sound. They argue that the jury heard all the evidence and made their decision based on what was presented. The clemency process has become contentious, with both sides presenting their arguments. Following a successful push for clemency and a review of the coercive nature of her 1995 interrogation, Shanda Crane was granted parole and released from prison in early 2024. She has spent the last 2 years reuniting with her family and speaking about interrogation reform. For her parents, family, and friends, the case remains a source of pain, regardless of debates about Shanda's level of involvement. They lost loved ones and have had to live with the circumstances of those losses for decades. The clemency petition has reopened old wounds while also forcing a re-examination of what justice means in complex cases involving young people. Another case would involve mental health concerns during a family crisis. Heather Marie Daoust. In January 2008, in Poway, California, 14-year-old Heather Marie Daoust used a hammer during a confrontation with her adoptive mother, Rebecca. The incident occurred during what family members described as ongoing tensions in the household. Rebecca Daoust was harmed fatally. Heather's adoptive father was also harmed during the incident, but survived. The events of that day would result in Heather facing serious charges, while questions about her mental state became central to understanding what happened. The Daoust family had adopted Heather when she was younger. By her teenage years, there were challenges in the household. Arguments occurred with increasing frequency. Family members later described a pattern of escalating conflicts. On the day of the incident, a confrontation escalated beyond words. Heather obtained a hammer from somewhere in the home. What followed was a sustained attack on her mother. Rebecca sustained fatal injuries from being struck repeatedly with the hammer. When Heather's father attempted to intervene, he too was struck with the hammer. He survived his injuries, but witnessed the loss of his wife. Police responded to the scene and found Rebecca deceased and the father injured. Emergency medical services treated the father at the scene before transporting him to a hospital. Heather was taken into custody without incident. The investigation focused on what had led to such an extreme escalation of what had begun as a family argument. What brings a family confrontation to such a point? Mental health evaluations became a crucial part of the legal proceedings. Experts examined Heather to assess her psychological state, both at the time of the incident and afterward. The evaluations revealed significant mental health concerns. These findings influenced how the case would proceed. While they did not excuse what had happened, they provided context for understanding Heather's actions. The law recognizes that juveniles with mental health issues may bear different levels of culpability than adults or mentally healthy individuals. Rather than proceed to trial, Heather entered a plea. She pleaded guilty to second-degree taking of life. This plea acknowledged her actions while avoiding a trial where all details would be presented publicly. It also allowed the court to consider her mental health issues in sentencing. The plea meant accepting responsibility for Rebecca's passing while recognizing the complexity of the circumstances surrounding the incident. The court sentenced Heather to 16 years to life in prison. This sentence reflected both the severity of the act and her youth and mental health status at the time. She would be housed in facilities appropriate for juvenile offenders initially, then transferred to adult facilities as she aged. The sentence meant she would serve at minimum 16 years before being eligible for parole consideration. She would be in her 30s before that possibility arose. For Heather's adoptive father, the loss was compounded by complex emotions. His wife had been taken from him by their adopted daughter. He had survived the attack, but lost his family in multiple ways. The case raised questions about mental health support for adopted youth and the challenges families face when dealing with mental illness in teenagers. Heather Marie Daoust was granted parole in 2024 after serving the minimum of her 16 years to life sentence. She was released from custody later that year and continues to pursue her interest in writing as a free citizen. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case would involve relationship defiance taken to an extreme. Ashley Jones. In August 1999, in Mobile County, Alabama, 14-year-old Ashley Jones and her boyfriend, Jeremy Hart, carried out a plan that would end 3 lives. The victims were Ashley's grandparents, DeRoy and Millie Knowles, and her aunt, Mary Knowles. All 3 had expressed disapproval of the teenage relationship. For Ashley and Jeremy, this disapproval became something they decided could not be tolerated. The couple had been together despite objections from Jeremy's family. His grandparents, who were raising him, felt the relationship was inappropriate and harmful. They wanted it to end. His aunt supported their position. The teenagers saw these family members as obstacles to their relationship, rather than accept the boundaries being set. They developed a plan to remove these obstacles permanently. The planning took time. They discussed methods. They prepared themselves mentally for what they intended to do. On the day of the incident, Ashley and Jeremy put their plan into action. They used both a knife and a firearm. The attacks were sustained and deliberate. Each victim was targeted individually. Ashley's grandfather and grandmother were both shot and killed, while her aunt, Mary Knowles, was shot and sustained severe burns but survived the attack. The scene investigators would later examine showed signs of struggle, but also of overwhelming force. The victims had been unable to defend themselves effectively against 2 attackers. Could family disapproval truly drive such extreme actions? After the attacks, Ashley and Jeremy fled. They were found at a hotel where they were arrested. The evidence against them was substantial. Forensic analysis linked them to the scene. Witnesses could place them at the residence. Their motive was clear from statements made before and after the incident. During the investigation, Jeremy was quoted as having said to one of the victims, "This is how you are going to die." This statement revealed the premeditated nature of the attacks. The trial examined the evidence and the circumstances. Ashley was 14 at the time of the incident. Under Alabama law, she could be tried as an adult for such serious charges. The prosecution presented the case as a calculated plan carried out by 2 individuals who knew exactly what they were doing. The defense attempted to argue mitigating factors related to Ashley's youth and her relationship with Jeremy. They suggested she had been influenced by him. However, the evidence showed active participation on her part. Ashley Jones was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This sentence, given to someone who was 14 at the time of the incident, would later become part of broader debates about juvenile sentencing. The U.S. Supreme Court would eventually rule on cases involving juveniles sentenced to life without parole, questioning whether such sentences were constitutional for those under 18. Ashley's case became one of many cited in these discussions. For the families of the victims, the loss was devastating. 3 people had been taken because they had tried to set boundaries for a teenager. They had wanted to protect Jeremy from what they saw as an unhealthy relationship. Instead of heeding their concerns, the 2 teenagers had turned on them. while Ashley Jones remains incarcerated at the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women. She was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole in 2017, following the Miller v. Alabama ruling, making her eligible for a parole hearing in the coming years. Another case would involve the intersection of reform and repeated violations. Ruth Ann Veal. In October 1993, in Clinton, Iowa, 14-year-old Ruth Ann Veal stabbed 66-year-old Catherine Haynes. Catherine was in her home when Ruth Ann entered. The incident was connected to a robbery. Ruth Ann stabbed Catherine multiple times. The older woman could not defend herself. She passed away from her injuries. The case would become notable not just for the incident itself, but for what happened in the decades that followed. The investigation revealed that Ruth Ann had entered Catherine's residence with the intent to steal. When confronted or discovered, the situation escalated. Ruth Ann used a knife she had with her. The attack was sustained. Catherine suffered numerous stab wounds. The brutality of the attack stood in stark contrast to Ruth Ann's youth. Investigators worked to understand what had led a 14-year-old to such actions. Background checks revealed that Ruth Ann had experienced challenges in her own life, including a history that suggested mistreatment. Ruth Ann was arrested and charged with taking Catherine's life. She was tried and convicted. The sentencing reflected the seriousness of the crime. She received life in prison. At the time, there was little consideration for the fact that she was just 14. The sentence was mandatory under Iowa law for the conviction she received. Ruth Ann would spend years in prison, growing from a teenager into an adult behind bars. How does someone move forward after such actions committed as a youth? In later years, juvenile sentencing reforms began to change the landscape of cases like Ruth Ann's. The U.S. Supreme Court issued rulings barring automatic life sentences without parole for juveniles. These rulings recognized that young people have greater capacity for rehabilitation than adults. They acknowledged that brain development continues into the 20s and that decisions made in the teenage years do not necessarily reflect permanent character. These reforms gave Ruth Ann a chance she would not have had originally. Ruth Ann became eligible for parole consideration. She participated in programs during her incarceration. She expressed remorse for her actions. In later statements, she acknowledged the brutality of what she had done. Eventually, she was granted parole. This meant release under supervision with strict conditions. For a time, Ruth Ann appeared to be successfully reintegrating. She was placed in work release programs. She was taking steps toward building a life outside prison. However, Ruth Ann violated the terms of her parole. The specific violations involved failures to comply with supervision requirements. When someone on parole violates conditions, they can be returned to prison. Ruth Ann's parole was revoked. She was sent back to serve more time. She later applied for parole again, but was denied. The parole board considered her violations when making their decision. As of 2026, Ruth Ann Veal successfully completed her parole requirements and was fully discharged from state supervision in late 2025, marking the end of her sentence for the 1993 incident. The next case would involve modern technology and planning. Jermaine Lewis. In October 2022, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, 16-year-old Jermaine Lewis conspired online with Dwayne Barfield to arrange the shooting of her mother, Markesia Stone. The case would shock the community and highlight how technology can facilitate tragic plans. Jermaine and Dwayne communicated through digital platforms, discussing their intentions and making arrangements that would lead to Markesia's passing. The relationship between Jermaine and her mother had been strained. Family tensions had been building over time. Jermaine felt frustrated with restrictions and rules. Rather than seeking help or working through conflicts, she began communicating with Dwayne Barfield online. The conversations escalated from complaints to planning. They discussed how to carry out an attack on Markesia. They coordinated timing and methods. The digital trail of these communications would later become crucial evidence. On the day of the incident, Dwayne went to the residence where Germaine lived with her mother. Markesia was shot. She was transported to a hospital but could not be saved. Police immediately began investigating. They looked at who had been at the home. They examined possible motives. The investigation led them to Dwayne Barfield quickly. When they examined his communications, they discovered his exchanges with Germaine. The digital messages laid out the conspiracy clearly. What drives someone to plan their own mother's ending? Germaine was arrested and charged with principal to second-degree taking of life. This charge recognized that while she had not pulled the trigger herself, she had been instrumental in planning and facilitating what happened. The evidence against her was substantial. The digital communications showed clear intent and planning. There were discussions of motive. There were arrangements made for Dwayne to come to the residence. The prosecution had a strong case built largely on technology that preserved every detail of the conspiracy. Rather than proceed to trial, Germaine accepted a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to the charges against her. The plea meant acknowledging her role in the conspiracy and in her mother's passing. In exchange for the guilty plea, the prosecution and defense reached an agreement on sentencing. Germaine was sentenced to life in prison. However, unlike many life sentences, this one included the possibility of parole after serving 25 years. The sentence reflected both the severity of the crime and Germaine's youth at the time. At 16, she was old enough to understand her actions, but young enough that the law recognized potential for change over time. The parole eligibility after 25 years meant that in her early 40s, Germaine would have the opportunity to demonstrate rehabilitation and seek release. Whether she will be granted parole at that time will depend on her behavior during incarceration and the parole board's assessment of risk. For Markesia Stone's family, the digital evidence that helped convict Germaine also provided a painful window into the planning of their loved one's passing. They could see the discussions, the planning, the deliberation. This made the loss even more difficult to process. As of 2026, Germaine Lewis remains incarcerated. She will not be eligible for parole consideration until 2047. The case serves as a stark reminder of how family conflicts can escalate and how technology preserves evidence of conspiracy. Another case would involve a hired arrangement to avoid responsibility. Amy Lynn Priesmeyer. In March 1997, in Lancaster, California, 16-year-old Amy Lynn Priesmeyer hired Billy Hoffman to take the life of her boyfriend, Ricky Cowles. Amy was pregnant at the time. She blamed Ricky for what she described as ruining her life. Rather than dealing with the situation through legal means or family support, she made arrangements to have him harmed. The case would take years to solve and would eventually result in one of the harshest sentences for a juvenile female offender. Amy approached Billy Hoffman with a proposition. She wanted Ricky gone. She offered money and other incentives. Billy agreed to carry out the plan. On the day of the incident, Billy found Ricky and attacked him. Ricky was beaten severely. He was then shot. The attack was brutal and sustained. Ricky was left in a location where he was discovered, but medical intervention could not save him. The initial investigation struggled to identify suspects. The case went cold for years. What investigators did not initially realize was that Amy had orchestrated everything. She had returned to her normal life, raising the baby that Ricky had fathered. She showed no outward signs of involvement. Years passed. The case remained unsolved. Then, developments in the investigation brought new focus. Witnesses came forward with information. Billy Hoffman was identified and arrested. When he was questioned, he implicated Amy. He described the arrangement they had made. He explained that Amy had been the one who wanted Ricky harmed. Could someone really plan such an act, then live normally for years? Amy was arrested years after Ricky's passing. By this time, she was an adult. However, the charges stemmed from actions she had taken when she was 16. The trial examined the evidence carefully. Billy Hoffman testified about the arrangement. Other witnesses corroborated aspects of his account. The prosecutor stated during the trial that Amy had despised the victim, emphasizing the personal animosity behind the conspiracy. The defense attempted to argue that Amy had been young and had made a terrible mistake under pressure. The jury found Amy guilty of taking Ricky's life. The conviction came in 2007, a full decade after the incident itself. The sentencing phase considered both the severity of the crime and Amy's age at the time it was committed. Despite her youth when the incident occurred, the court imposed a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. This was one of the harshest sentences that could be given. It meant Amy would spend the rest of her life incarcerated with no chance of release. The sentence reflected the premeditated nature of the crime. Amy had not acted in the heat of passion. She had not made a split-second decision. She had planned, negotiated, and arranged for someone else to carry out an attack. The fact that she had hired someone made the crime particularly calculated. The court found these factors outweighed considerations of her youth. As of 2026, Amy Lynn Priesmeyer is a free citizen, having been granted parole and released from the Central California Women's Facility in 2022 under California's youth offender parole laws. For Ricky Cowles' family, the decade of waiting for justice was agonizing. When Amy was finally convicted, they felt some measure of closure. However, knowing that she had lived freely for years while they grieved added to their pain. The case demonstrated that some crimes, even when committed by juveniles, result in permanent consequences. The next case would involve extreme actions tied to mental health struggles. Delilah Sherwood Evans. On Christmas Day in 2016 in Clinton Township, Michigan, 17-year-old Delilah Sherwood Evans stabbed her mother, Sonia Riang, 120 times. Sonia was wheelchair-bound, unable to defend herself or escape. The attack occurred in the family home and would become one of the most disturbing cases due to both the sustained nature of the assault and the victim's vulnerability. The case would raise significant questions about mental health and family dynamics. Delilah and her mother had experienced ongoing conflicts. Family disputes had escalated over time. On Christmas Day, a holiday meant for celebration, the tensions reached a breaking point. Delilah obtained a knife. What followed was a sustained attack. Sonia was stabbed repeatedly. The number of wounds suggested rage or a complete loss of control. Forensic analysis would later confirm that many of the wounds were inflicted after Sonia could no longer defend herself or even move. When emergency responders arrived at the scene, they found Sonia deceased. The scene was described as extremely disturbing. The extent of the attack shocked even experienced investigators. Delilah was taken into custody. During initial questioning, it became clear that mental health issues were a significant factor. Delilah's behavior and statements suggested she was experiencing serious psychological distress. The question became not just what had happened, but what had driven someone to such extreme actions. How does the justice system handle cases where mental illness intersects with extreme harm? Delilah underwent extensive mental health evaluations. Experts examined her psychological state. The evaluations revealed significant mental health conditions. These findings became central to how the case proceeded. Michigan law allows for a verdict of guilty but mentally ill. Michigan law allows for a verdict of guilty but mentally ill. This verdict acknowledges that the person committed the act, but recognizes that mental illness was a major factor. It provides for treatment during incarceration while still holding the person accountable. The trial resulted in Delilah being found guilty but mentally ill. The court considered both the severity of what had happened to Sonia and the mental health factors that contributed to Delilah's actions. Although originally sentenced to life without parole, Delilah Evans had her conviction vacated in 2020. She subsequently reached a plea agreement in late 2023 for a sentence of 20 to 40 years, which includes credit for time already served. As of 2026, there have been developments regarding potential retrial or resentencing, though Delilah remains incarcerated pending these proceedings. Another case would result in eventual release and a second chance. Valessa Robinson. In June 1998, in Tampa, Florida, 15-year-old Valessa Robinson, along with her boyfriend and his friend, took the life of her mother, Vicki Robinson. The incident involved choking, the injection of a harmful substance, and stabbing. The motive was rooted in Valessa's desire to remain with her boyfriend. Vicki had been trying to separate them, believing the relationship was harmful. Rather than accept this separation, Valessa participated in planning and carrying out her mother's ending. Valessa had become involved with an older boyfriend who her mother felt was a negative influence. Vicki expressed concerns about the relationship. She set boundaries. She attempted to keep them apart. For Valessa, these efforts felt like control rather than protection. She began spending more time with her boyfriend and his friend. Together, the three of them discussed what to do about Vicki. The discussions turned to planning. They decided that removing Vicki was the solution to their problem. The attack on Vicki was sustained and involved multiple methods. She was choked. Bleach was injected into her system. She was stabbed. The combination of methods suggested desperation or determination to ensure she would not survive. After Vicki's passing, the three attempted to conceal what had happened. They moved the body. They tried to create a story that would explain Vicki's absence. However, the investigation quickly uncovered inconsistencies. Physical evidence at the scene contradicted their accounts. Can a teenager comprehend the permanence of taking a parent's life? All three were arrested. Valessa faced charges despite being 15. The evidence showed clear participation. She had been present. She had been part of discussions. She had helped with concealment. The trial examined who had been the primary instigator. The defense argued Valessa had been influenced by her older boyfriend. The prosecution countered that she had actively participated. Valessa was convicted of third-degree taking of life, a lesser charge than first-degree, reflecting some consideration of her youth and level of involvement. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison. This sentence meant she would serve time, but would eventually have the opportunity for release. During her incarceration, Valessa participated in programs. She received education. She engaged with counseling. By all accounts, she used her time to work on understanding what had led her to that point in 1998. She expressed remorse for what had happened to her mother. Valessa Robinson was released in 2013 after serving her sentence. Following her release, she worked to rebuild her life. She reconnected with family members who had stood by her. She eventually became a mother herself. In interviews after her release, she spoke about her life. She described it as good. She talked about the second chance she had been given. She acknowledged the tragedy of what had happened, but focused on moving forward. Valessa's case became one of the more positive examples of juvenile rehabilitation. She had committed a serious offense at 15. She had served her time. She had participated in rehabilitation programs. Upon release, she had successfully reintegrated into society. She had not reoffended. She had built a life. While she lived as a free citizen for several years, Valessa Robinson was arrested in 2021 on charges including DUI and property damage, demonstrating that her reintegration was not without significant legal setbacks. The final case would involve a conspiracy between classmates. Annika Stalczynski. In November 2020, in Smyrna, Delaware, 17-year-old Annika Stalczynski conspired with Noah Sharp to lure their classmate Madison Sparrow into the woods. Madison was beaten to an extent that proved fatal. The motive appeared to involve rumors and interpersonal conflicts among teenagers. The case would shock the small community and raise questions about how quickly peer conflicts can escalate when adults are not aware or intervening. Annika and Noah attended school with Madison. There had been tensions among the students. Rumors circulated. Conflicts simmered. Rather than allowing these typical teenage dynamics to resolve through normal channels, Annika and Noah developed a plan. They decided to confront Madison directly. They made arrangements to get her alone. They chose a wooded area where they could act without immediate discovery. The planning involved coordination and deception. On the day of the incident, they successfully lured Madison to the predetermined location. Once in the woods, away from witnesses, they attacked her. Madison was beaten repeatedly. The attack was sustained and severe. She could not effectively defend herself against two attackers. She suffered injuries that would prove fatal. After the attack, Annika and Noah left the scene. Madison's body was discovered later. The investigation began immediately. What turns teenage conflicts into such extreme actions? Police worked to identify who had been with Madison before her passing. The investigation uncovered communications between Annika and Noah. Digital evidence showed planning. Witnesses placed them with Madison. Forensic evidence linked them to the scene. The case against both teenagers grew strong quickly. Both Annika and Noah were arrested and charged. The evidence was presented to them and their legal teams. Facing the strength of the prosecution's case, both decided to accept plea agreements rather than proceed to trial. Annika Stalczynski pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, possession of a deadly weapon during the commission of a felony, and conspiracy for her role in the 2020 attack on Madison Sparrow. In exchange, the prosecution recommended a specific sentence. The recommendation was for 30 years in prison. This sentence would be reviewable after serving the full term, meaning there would be no early parole consideration. The judge accepted the plea agreement and imposed the recommended sentence. During the proceedings, Delaware's Attorney General spoke about the case. The official described the actions as showing a level of depravity that was beyond comprehension. The statement reflected the community's shock at what had occurred. Madison had been a classmate. She had been a peer. The fact that fellow students had planned and carried out such an attack disturbed many. Questions arose about what warning signs might have been missed. Could this have been prevented if adults had been more aware of the conflicts? For Madison Sparrow's family, the loss was devastating. They had lost their daughter to peer conflict that escalated beyond what anyone could have imagined. The fact that it was planned rather than spontaneous made it harder to process. Madison had been deliberately targeted. She had been lured to a location where she would be vulnerable. The planning involved showed a level of calculation that seemed incompatible with teenage peer conflicts. As of 2026, Annika Stalczynski remains incarcerated in Delaware. She will serve her 30-year sentence. When she is eventually released, she will be in her late 40s. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.